On a bitter winter night, Harold stood in his quiet log cabin with one hand on the door, listening to the wind drag along the porch boards. For years he had believed his winters would stay empty. When he finally opened it, a cloudy glass jar sat in the snow like a lantern, and inside a bobcat cub twisted and pawed, its spotted head knocking softly against the rim. Just beyond the circle of light, the cub's mother paced in the dark, strong and restless, her pale eyes never leaving his hands. Alone between the warm stove behind him and the wild family in front of him, Harold had to decide whether to close the door on the storm or kneel in the cold and try to free that fragile life. The winter had settled in so firmly that the mountains hardly seemed to breathe. Snow lay thick along the roofline of the small cabin, softening the edges of the porch and swallowing the road that wound down toward town. Inside, the old man stood at the window with his mug, watching his own breath cloud the glass as dawn thinned the darkness over the pines. The place was quiet enough that he could hear the stove ticking as it cooled and the faint hum of the old refrigerator in the corner. The beams overhead creaked now and then. The long, tired stretch of old wood adjusting to the cold. Harold had lived with those sounds for years. They were as familiar as the ache in his knees. Yet, beneath them this week, something else seemed to move. On the third morning after the big storm, he saw small marks on the top step when he opened the door. They looked like half moons pressed into the fresh powder, arranged in pairs that climbed and turned and vanished at the edge of the porch. He studied them from the doorway, fingers tight on the frame, and finally muttered that it was probably just some light-footed visitor from the woods. That night, long after Head banked the stove and turned out the lamp, a sharp clink of glass woke him. His eyes snapped open in the dark. For a moment he lay still, listening to his heart drum in his ears. Another sound came, a faint tap, then a scrape, as if something had nudged the shelf outside where he kept his extra jars and odds and ends. He pushed up, bones protesting, and shuffled to the front window. Beyond the pane, the world was a wash of silver, the snow glowing under a thin moon. The porch rail cast a pale shadow onto the drifted steps. Nothing moved. He told himself it was just the wind rattling something loose and went back to bed, though the hairs on his arms stayed awake. By morning, the top jar on the porch shelf had shifted. He could see the clear ring it had left in the thin layer of dust on the board, just a few inches from where it usually sat. He frowned, picked it up, and set it firmly back in place. The air held a faint, unfamiliar scent, something wild and musky that faded as quickly as he noticed it. That evening, while the radio murmured low in the background, there came another sound from outside, a dull bump against the wall, then a soft scraping along the floorboards of the porch. Harold turned the volume down, holding his breath. The cabin seemed to lean with him, A second bump came, closer this time, followed by the faintest shiver of the shelf. His skin prickled beneath his wool shirt. He opened the door and stepped onto the porch, the cold biting straight through his socks. The night met him with stillness, as if it had been holding its breath. 2. Along the wall, a shallow trough had been pressed into the snow where something had passed repeatedly, brushing against the boards. He told himself it might just be snow slumping off the roof, though it was too narrow and too neat for that. The wind picked up and slid icy fingers down the back of his neck. He moved slowly along the porch, hand on the rail, listening. Off among the pines, there was a rustle, then a soft, heavy exhale that didn't sound like wind at all. He couldn't see anything but trunks and darkness, yet he felt eyes on him, steady and measuring, from just beyond the first line of trees. The next morning, the jar was no longer on the shelf. It lay on its side near the bottom step, mouth tilted toward the yard, rim frosted from breath that wasn't his. Inside, the glass was fogged in delicate arcs, as if something warm had pressed repeatedly against it from within. A narrow trail of disturbed powder led away into the trees, weaving between the drifts. Harold bent to pick the jar up, his fingers brushing the cold glass. For a second, he thought he saw a pale hair caught on the rim, short and thick and unlike anything from his own head or coat. When he blinked, it was gone. "You're imagining things," he told himself out loud, the sound of his voice surprisingly small in the clear morning air. That night, he left the lamp off and sat in his chair by the window, letting the room grow dim around him. Snowflakes wandered past the glass, turning slowly in the wind. Somewhere past the woodpile, a shadow slid between two tree trunks low, powerful, with a hint of pale pattern where the moonlight touched it. A moment later came the quiet tap of glass against wood. His pulse jumped hard enough that he could feel it in his throat. This was not just the house settling or loose tools shifting on a shelf. Something was circling his porch, touching the same spot, moving the same object, night after night. When he finally bolted the door and turned the lock, the soft clink sounded once more from outside, as if answering the twist of his hand. He stood there in the dark, knowing, with a certainty he couldn't explain, that he was not alone. Morning came blue and sharp, the kind of cold that made the boards cry out when he stepped on them. Harold opened the door cautiously, breath puffing ahead of him. The jar sat upright on the top step now, as neatly placed as if someone had set it there for him. Around it, the snow was disturbed in small, tidy ovals that circled and overlapped. He squinted at the marks, leaning on the doorframe for balance. They were too large for a squirrel, too deliberate for a rabbit, and they came in pairs, left, right, with a depth that spoke of real weight. A faint track ran from the steps to the tree line, pressed into the powder like a stitched path. Maybe a fox, he muttered, though Head never seen one leave prints quite like that. All that day, the image of the jar on the step stayed with him. When he boiled potatoes for his midday meal, he kept glancing at the window without meaning to, half expecting to see it move. A soft thud on the wall made him start, only to find it was just a branch sliding free of snow. He chuckled at himself, feeling foolish, and told the empty room that getting old meant jumping at branches now. Toward late afternoon, as the light thinned to silver, a new sound threaded through the steady hush of the forest. It was a faint, rhythmic tap glass against wood coming from the porch. Harold set his cup down carefully and walked to the door, every step deliberate. The tapping stopped the moment his hand touched the handle. He eased the door open a crack. The cold rushed in, sharp enough to sting his nose. The jar was tipped on its side again, rocking slightly. For a heartbeat he thought it was the wind. Then the jar jolted forward a few inches, as if something inside had stumbled. A small, pale muzzle pressed briefly against the fogged glass, whiskers flattened, breath blooming in tiny clouds. Harold's own breath caught. Through the distortion of the curved glass, he saw eyes round, wide, and ringed with dark markings that seemed too intricate to belong to anything ordinary. The little head bumped the front of the jar again, clumsy and urgent, paws scrabbling in the snow. The jar wobbled, but whatever was inside couldn't pull free. A shape moved in the shadows just beyond the steps, large and silent. He felt rather than saw it, a presence low to the ground, calm and coiled. A tail, thick and long, slid once across the snow, leaving a sweeping mark like a brushstroke. The air itself seemed to hesitate. Harold froze in the doorway, fingers numb on the handle, every instinct torn between stepping forward and slamming the door. The soft sound came again, a deep, steady rumble that vibrated in his chest more than in his ears. It wasn't a growl exactly. It was something older, a warning and a question woven together. The little prisoner in the jar toppled onto its side, legs flailing. The larger shadow shifted, muscles rolling under pale winter fur mottled with darker spots. Harold's knees felt suddenly unsteady. He closed the hammered hard enough that he could feel each beat in his fingertips. "You're too old for this kind of nonsense," he whispered to himself, but his voice shook. Whatever he had just seen was no fox, and no house cat wandering up from town. That night he dreamed of glass and snow and wide, frightened eyes. He woke twice with his hands clenched as if he were gripping something tight. The second time, a familiar creak came from the porch, followed by the scrape of the jar being dragged, and the low, patient exhale of the unseen watcher. He lay still, listening, the weight of their presence pressing through the thin cabin walls. When morning finally arrived, the jar was once again standing upright on the step, its rim lightly dusted with frost. Next to it lay a small tuft of pale fur, thick and soft, tipped in silver. Harold picked it up gently, feeling the ending in faint arcs where claws did not quite touch the snow. He knew, without wanting to say it aloud, that the mountains had sent him a very particular kind of neighbour. He looked out toward the tree line, where the shadows of the pines pooled in the hollows. Somewhere out there, a larger set of those same tracks waited, watching his little cabin, measuring his every move. Why here? He asked the empty forest. Why now? No answer came. Just the stillness of the cold air and the echo of his own question hanging between him and the trees. Before that winter, Harold had thought he knew the rhythms of the high country. For 20 years, ever since he retired from fixing boilers at the school, Head spent his winters as caretaker at the old research station above town. It was a simple arrangement: keep the pipes from freezing, keep the generator running, and send snowpack reports down the mountain when the radio would cooperate. Head come up the first year just to see if he could stand the quiet after his wife, Marion, passed. The cabin hadn't felt much different from their little bungalow in town. Really one more place with a kettle, an armchair, and a photograph on the mantel. But out here, the silence had weight, and the stars felt close enough to rest his grief on. He kept coming back. It was the younger researchers Hod first spoken of the pale ghosts in the higher ridges. They set camera traps on ledges and along narrow passes, then brought the memory cards back down like treasure. Harold would sit at the rough wooden table while they clicked through pixelated night shots, pointing out a blur of tail here, a faint spotted shoulder there. Had grown used to seeing those shapes in black and white. One autumn, 3 years before the jar appeared on his step, a particular series of images had caught his attention. On a grainy photo, a smaller shape trailed close behind a larger one, the two bodies moving in the same line, paws falling in the same places. The younger one's head turned once toward the camera, eyes reflecting the flash like small moons. A cub, they'd said, maybe 4 months old. Harold had stared a little longer than usual. That winter had been lean. Snow came early and stayed, and the radio carried stories of animals wandering lower than usual, hungry enough to risk the scent of people. One night, when the wind howled so hard it shook the shutters, Harold had opened his door to find the faintest set of tracks circling the cabin, drifting in and out of the drifts as if someone had walked a slow, cautious ring around his porch. Head stepped back inside and torn a chunk of leftover roast into pieces, his hands moving before Head decided anything. Without really thinking, Head set the meat on a flat rock a few yards from the steps and gone back in. By morning, the pieces were gone and the snow around the stone was stippled with careful, round impressions. For days after, he had the sense of being watched whenever he stepped out for wood. In the spring, fresh camera images came down from the higher ridges. The same adult moved along the cliffs, shoulders thick and strong. The researchers murmured approval, noting the good condition of her coat. The cub appeared at her side in only a few frames now, leaner, longer-legged, already less child and more shadow. He wondered, privately, if those had been the same paws outside his cabin, learning the boundary between curiosity and caution. The world had left its mark on them as surely as it had on him. Somewhere up there, the mother had likely lost siblings to snares or missteps. Many did. Head heard of one that stepped into a metal loop meant for deer and wore the scar for the rest of its life. Humans meant both danger and food in these mountains, and trust was a thin, frayed rope stretched over a deep ravine. Harold had his own reasons for treating trust carefully. Years earlier, before the research folks arrived, Head called in a report after seeing movement near an old mining road. The response was overzealous trucks, bright lights, men eager for a rare trophy. By the time they stomped their way up the slope, nothing remained but scattered tracks and a clump of pale hair caught on a shrub. Head watched the trucks leave with a heavy knot in his chest, wondering what exactly Head invited onto the mountain. Since then, Head kept most of what he saw to himself. When he glimpsed a long tail along a distant ridge, he simply stored the image away like a pressed leaf between the pages of his memory. When he found those cautious circles in the snow near the cabin, he answered with meat on the rock and silence on the radio. It felt like an agreement, unspoken but real. Now, standing over the jar-marked snow, he couldn't help but think of that cub in the old photographs, padding in its mother's footsteps. Seasons had turned. Young bodies had grown into strong hunters. The visitor outside his door was no ghost from a grainy image. It was flesh and breath and clever. Stubborn life. And it had managed to wedge its head into a piece of his world it didn't understand. Trust ran both ways. He knew. Whatever walked out there had taken a risk, tugging that glass burden up onto his porch where his scent lay thickest. It meant his presence, for all its human clumsiness, was part of the map in their minds. The thought both warmed and unsettled him. The mountains remembered every kindness and every mistake. He wasn't sure yet which one this would turn out to be. By the time dusk folded itself over the hills again, his decision was made in the quiet space beneath his ribs, even if he hadn't spoken it aloud. If the little fool came back wearing that same clear helmet, he would do more than watch through the window. He owed the mountains better than another memory of inaction. The next evening settled slowly, grey light draining from the slopes until only the porch lamp pushed back the dark in a yellow circle. Harold left it on deliberately, the door unlocked, his heavy coat hanging on the peg by the frame. He pretended to read, the print swimming occasionally as his eyes drifted toward the window. Every creak of the cabin twisted his stomach a little tighter. The first sound, when it came, was soft, a hesitant scrape, like glass nudged across dry wood. He set his book down, marking the page with one finger. Another scrape followed, then a hollow bump against the door jamb. The lamp flame inside its glass chimney wavered slightly as if sharing his nerves. Harold rose, joints complaining, and slid his arms into his coat. At the doorway he paused, one hand on the knob, and inhaled slowly. The air on the far side of the door felt colder, sharper, as if a different world waited inches away. He cracked it open. The smell hit him first snow, pine, and a wild, musky sweetness that was nothing like the wood smoke and coffee behind him. The jar sat almost at his feet, fogged with breath, tilted so that the lip rested in a shallow groove worn into the snow. Inside, a small head turned blindly toward the light, ears flattened, whiskers squashed along the glass, compact shoulders bunched and pushed, the little body slipping and scrambling, paws scritching helplessly at the porch boards. Beyond the lamp's reach, just at the edge of shadow, the larger figure waited. Pale winter fur, patterned with dark rosettes, rose and fell with each breath. Powerful legs were tucked beneath a low, ready frame. The long tail lay half-curled, tip twitching once when Harold stepped out, too pale. Leaving it hooked with his elbow in case his courage failed. "Easy," he murmured, his voice sounding thin in the open air. "I see you. I see you both." The words puffed white and vanished. The waiting mother neither advanced nor retreated. Only that tail tip moved. A slow, warning metronome. Harold crouched as far as his knees would allow. Every motion deliberate. The little prisoner flailed again, jar clunking against the step. A tiny paw struck his boot, pads cold and surprisingly soft even through the leather. He could hear its rapid breathing, the panicked rasp against glass. He remembered all at once how it felt to stand helpless beside a hospital bed, watching someone he loved struggle for air they couldn't catch. "I'm going to help," he said quietly, though he knew they didn't understand the words. Maybe they would hear the steadiness he was trying to put into them. He set one gloved hand on the jar, not yet pulling, giving the mother a chance to object. The big body in the shadows tensed, head lowering. A low sound rolled across the snow, deep and uncertain. Harold didn't back away. Instead, he lifted his gaze to hers and held it, not challenging, simply present. "You brought him here," he whispered, more to himself than to her. "You dragged this foolish thing up to my doorstep." Something in him recognized the trust in that gesture, however desperate. He tightened his grip and gently rocked the jar, testing how firmly it held. The little head inside turned with the movement, ears popping slightly as the glass shifted. He felt the thin edge of the rim catch against fur and skin. With his free hand, he braced the cub's shoulders through the smooth surface, giving it something to push against. On 3, he breathed, though he didn't count. He pulled with a steady, twisting motion. For a second, the glass resisted, sucking tight around the small skull. Then, with a soft, wet pop, it slid free. The cub tumbled backward into the snow, blinking hard against the sudden rush of cold air. Its spotted nose dusted white. It shook itself, spraying tiny bits of ice, and sneezed with offended vigor. The mother was there in an instant, a blur of strength and fur. She flowed around the cub, body forming a shield between him and the man. Harold froze again, jar in his hands, lungs burning as he forgot to breathe. The big head swung toward him, eyes catching the lamplight in pale gold. For a moment, the world shrank to that gaze. Instead of surging forward, she lowered her head slightly and blinked once. Slowly, each lid closing and opening with measured calm. The rumble in her chest shifted, losing its edge. The cub, already recovering from its fright, planted its feet and stared back at Harold with intense curiosity, tail tip flicking. Harold let out the breath he'd been holding, his shoulders sagging. "You're welcome," he said softly, clutching the empty jar to his chest. The cub took a small, bold step toward him before a gentle nudge from its mother reoriented it toward the trees. Together they slipped back into the darkness, snow whispering under their paws. until only the swaying tips of the pines marked their passing. He stood there a long time, the cold gnawing at his fingers through the gloves, the jar cooling rapidly against his coat. The place where the mother had blinked at him felt oddly bright in his mind, like a lantern lit in a room Head kept dim for years. When he finally stepped back inside, he set the jar on the table instead of returning it to the porch shelf. The round fog marks on the glass were already fading, but the shape of that small, stubborn head remained clear in his thoughts. The mountains rarely gave without asking something back. A week after the jar came off, the radio crackled to life with the sharp voice of the ranger down in town, warning of a heavy front moving in. Harold jotted down the forecast with stiff fingers, falling temperatures, high winds, possible whiteout conditions on the upper slopes. It would be the kind of storm that tested old roofs and older hearts. Time to come down. Harold, the ranger said at the end of the report, his tone softening. Road will be rough if you wait. We can send a snowcat up before it hits. Harold promised Head, think about it, and set the handset back in its cradle. The cabin hummed quietly around him. Walls steeped in years of his breath and Marian's laughter that still seemed to cling in corners. Leaving before the storm felt too much like leaving for good. Outside, the air had a strange, charged stillness. Clouds stacked themselves behind the peaks like slow-moving walls. The prints appeared on the path earlier that day than usual, 2 sets. One large and one small, circling the rock where Head once left scraps, then climbing toward the cabin. The cub's tracks danced in loops and leaps. The mothers moved in patient, purposeful lines. Around mid-afternoon, a new behaviour began. The pair no longer stopped at the porch. Instead, they passed by and continued along the narrow trail that curved behind the cabin toward the ridge. Twice, Harold watched from the window as the cub paused to look back, head cocked, before bounding after its mother. Each time, he felt a faint tug in his chest, as if an invisible line had been thrown his way. He told himself they were simply following their own business. Yet when the cub appeared alone in the thinning light, pacing back and forth at the edge of the porch as if waiting, his heart rate climbed. It kept glancing toward the ridge path, then back at the front door, tail flicking with restless urgency. Snowflakes drifted down, fat and slow, the first scouts of the approaching storm. Harold opened the door a crack. The cub turned sharply, spots sharp against its winter coat, and let out a soft, questioning sound that floated through the cold air. Behind it, the ridge trail yawned white and narrow between dark rocks. Somewhere up there, unseen, the mother's deeper call rolled faintly through the trees. "You want me to follow?" he murmured. The idea was absurd. He was 72, with a heart his doctor watched like a fragile engine. The last time he'd gone far up the ridge alone was the day they'd scattered Marian's ashes from the overlook, her favourite view of the valley. He hadn't set foot there since. His chest tightened at the memory. Pain and love braided together. The cub took a few steps toward the trail, then trotted back, leaving a pattern of tracks that looked As he approached, she shifted, revealing a fallen spruce trunk lodged precariously near the edge, its roots torn from the loose soil by earlier winds. Beneath it, the snow sagged ominously over an unseen drop. The path he'd always used to reach Marian's spot was half blocked by unstable debris. A chill that had nothing to do with the weather slid through him. The cub trotted up to the dangerous edge and stopped short, ears flattening. It looked back at Harold, then at its mother, then at the teetering trunk, giving a small, urgent cry. The message didn't need translation. Something here was wrong, and they had brought him to see it. He stood there, storm pressing closer, torn between the past that had kept him away from this place and the present that now asked him, plainly, to act. Harold's breath came in shallow bursts as he studied the scene. The fallen spruce leaned out over the drop like a tired arm, its weight grinding slowly against the crumbling edge. One more hard gust of wind and it could slide free, taking a good slice of the path with it. Anyone, human or animal, using that trail in the storm could be swept into the void with hardly a sound. The mother shifted her weight, paws gripping the snow with deliberate care. She moved a few steps away from the edge and sat, eyes flicking between Harold and the unstable trunk. The cub mimicked her, sitting squarely in front of him as if blocking his way forward. A low, steady rumble came from the mother's chest, not threatening now but insistent, a sound that seemed to say, "Look, remember, do something." He knew what needed to happen. The ranger had to be warned. The old trail, marked on tourist maps and still beloved by ambitious hikers, was now a trap waiting to spring. The practical path was to turn around and go back, use the radio, let younger legs and safer equipment handle it. Yet his feet rooted to the spot, just beyond the fallen tree. Past the crumbling edge lay the small outcrop where he had last seen Marian's smile. Snow swirled around him, blurring the line between past and present. In his memory, the sky on that day had been bright, the valley below a spill of autumn gold. Marian's scarf, the same one in his pocket, now had flapped against his arm as she laughed, telling him not to look so solemn about scattering ashes. "I'm not leaving you," Shed said. "I'm just going ahead to save us a seat with a view." He had smiled then. But later, alone in their house, the image of the empty outcrop had become unbearable. He stopped coming. Now, the very place Head avoided tugged at him through the fear. The cub bumped gently against his leg, then stepped toward the safer side of the overlook, where a narrow but stable route led to a small, flat patch of rock set back from the edge. It looked, he realized with a soft jolt, remarkably like the spot where he and Marian had spread out a blanket on one of their first picnics. Decades before, he had forgotten there was another place to stand here, a few feet from the precipice, separate but still holding the same view. He followed slowly, boots crunching through the snow. The mother moved with him, keeping herself between him and the drop, her body a living guardrail. When they reached the sheltered patch, he saw something half buried near the rock face, a tin cup, dulled by sun and storms. He bent and picked it up, thumb tracing the small dent near the rim where Marian had once dropped it on a stone. They had left it up here by accident on that last hike together, years before illness took her. Harold's throat tightened. The cup felt warm despite the cold, life rushing up through the metal from his own palm. How many storms had it sat through up here, unnoticed, while he hid from the view that had once been theirs. The cub hopped lightly onto the rock, sniffed the cup, then bumped its nose against his hand, leaving a dusting of snow on his knuckles. "That's what you've been trying to show me," he whispered, voice hoarse. Not just the danger of the fallen tree, though that mattered, but this forgotten piece of his life, waiting on the mountain like a held breath. The animals had walked the ridges all these years, crossing and recrossing the paths of his grief. And somehow, this winter, they had chosen to lead him back to the place where he had stopped moving. He sank carefully onto the rock, joints stiff, and let himself look out fully over the valley. Even under the storm's advance, it was beautiful, the river, a dark ribbon, the town below a handful of small lights, his own cabin's roof a speck among the trees. The wind roared above, but within the circle of the three of them, man, mother, and cub, there was a surprising calm. The mother lay down a few feet away, paws tucked under, eyes half-lidded but alert. Snow dusted her back, sparkling in the dim light. The cub curled beside her, but kept its gaze on Harold, as if unwilling to let him disappear into his memories again. He reached into his pocket and pulled out Marianne's scarf, unrolling the faded yarn with trembling hands. "I should have brought you up here more often," he said softly, speaking to the valley, to the scarf, to the animals, to the absence that had weighed so long on his chest. "I thought staying away meant I was honouring what we had, but I think I was just stuck." His words were snatched and scattered by the wind, but saying them out loud loosened something inside him that had been clenched for years. He tied the scarf gently around the base of a nearby sapling, letting the ends flutter toward the drop. Then he turned back toward the fallen tree. From this angle, he could see clearly how close it was to breaking free, roots dangling above dizzying emptiness. He lifted the radio from his belt. He had brought it on habit and pressed the call button. His voice steadier than he expected as he reported the danger and the exact location. When he finished, the ranger promised to close the trail from below and send a crew when the storm allowed. Harold clipped the radio back to his belt and looked at his companions. "That's the best I can do," he told them quietly. The mother rose, stretched in a ripple of muscle, and gave a short, approving chuff. The cub bounded toward him suddenly, brushed its shoulder lightly against his knee, and then darted back to her side, as if sealing an agreement. As they all turned to descend together, snow beginning to thicken around them, Harold felt a strange lightness in his chest. The mountain had taken one goodbye from him long ago. Today, guided by a wild family that owed him nothing and yet had chosen to trust him, he had reclaimed the place where that farewell had frozen his heart. The storm was still coming, but inside, Something had broken open to let warmth move again. The storm kept its promise that night. Wind screamed along the ridges, rattling the cabin's windows and driving snow into high, sculpted drifts. Harold sat near the stove, listening to the roar and to the occasional metallic creak of the roof. Yet beneath the noise, he felt steadier than he had in years. The radio crackled once, with the ranger's voice confirming the trail closure, then fell quiet. By morning, the world outside was transformed into a deep, clean silence. The sky hung low and white, muffling the usual echo of the valley. Harold opened the door cautiously, leaning against the push of piled snow. The porch looked like the prow of a ship cutting through a frozen sea. Across its surface, a familiar set of tracks curved neatly, two large, two smaller-like notes written on a blank page. He stepped out and followed the pattern around the cabin. Near the woodpile, he found a small, unexpected gift. A tuft of fur from a mountain hare, left beside the rock where Head once placed scraps of roast. The offering made him smile despite himself. "You keep your hair," he said aloud, leaving it where it lay. "I've got oatmeal." But he couldn't deny the quiet pleasure of being included in their circuits. Over the next weeks, a new rhythm settled around the old cabin. Each morning, he checked the ridge with his binoculars, watching for movement near the dangerous overlook until the ranger's crew finally reached it and cut the fallen spruce into harmless pieces. Some evenings, when the light was just right, he would glimpse pale bodies moving along higher ledges, silhouettes against the pink snow as the mother taught her cub the safe paths. The jar, once a simple piece of clutter, now held a place of honor on the kitchen table. At night, he dropped a candle into it and let the flame shine through the cloudy glass, throwing soft patterns on the ceiling. From outside, through the window, it must have looked like a small, steady star. Sometimes, as he sipped his tea, he saw the shadow of a broad head pause by the snowbank to watch the light flicker. Down in town, the story began to travel in its own way. The ranger, carefully avoiding details that would make anyone think of trophies, told the visiting researchers about the unstable trail, and the caretaker horde spotted it just in time. When one of the young biologists hiked up with new camera traps, Harold mentioned, almost casually, that He'd seen the family often near the cabin. Together they set a camera on a tree facing the porch, its little eye watching where he had once watched alone. Weeks later, the memory card revealed a series of clear images. The mother approaching the porch light, whiskers frosted, the cub nosing curiously at the door, both glancing sometimes toward the window where Harold's lamp glowed. One frame showed the cub pressing its nose to the jar glass while Harold's hand steadied it. the angle had caught only his coat sleeve and the jar, but the story hummed in the space between them. The researchers asked if they might share a few stills for a conservation newsletter. He agreed, on the condition that no exact location be given. The small-town diner where he and Marion once stopped for pie added a new photograph to its cluttered wall near the register, a printed copy of one of those images. The cub's eyes wide and earnest behind the glass. The faint outline of Harold's weathered hand visible on the jar. Underneath, someone had written in neat marker, "Neighbours come in all sizes." The first time he saw it, he stood there longer than he meant to, one hand resting lightly on the frame. Visitors drove the snowy road a bit more often after that, hoping for a distant glimpse of the famous mountain family. Most left having seen nothing but tracks and the curve of the hills, though a few swore they'd seen a pale shadow high above. Harold found that he didn't mind the occasional company. He sat on the porch steps with his thermos, chatting with hikers about safe trails and quiet watching, urging respect more than excitement. Through it all, the mother and cub continued their rounds. Sometimes Harold would look up from chopping kindling to find them already present, perched on a boulder, watching with the solemn patience of the wild. On especially cold evenings, the cub would lie in the lee of the porch, tail wrapped over its nose, while the mother kept watch from a slight rise, body outlined against the starlit snow. He spoke to them then in the same low-tone head once used with Marion when they walked these slopes together, telling them about small things, how the generator sounded healthier this year, how the school kids in town had sent a card after hearing about the trailhead helped close. There were days when his chest still ached and his legs protested every step, but the cabin no longer felt like a waiting room between one winter and the next. It felt like part of a larger circuit, linked by tracks and memories and shared vigilance. At night, when he blew out the candle in the jar, the afterimage of its glow lingered behind his eyes long after the dark had settled. Spring came slowly to the high country, as it always did first as a softening of the snow crust, then as a change in the sound of the river far below, louder and more insistent. Patches of dark earth appeared along the south-facing slopes, and hardy shoots of grass pushed through, tentative but determined. Harold's joints felt the shift before his eyes did. The deep cold loosened its grip on his bones. One bright morning, his grandson Daniel arrived in a dusty pickup, the bed piled with supplies and a new set of batteries for the radio. The boy, though he was nearly 30 now, had his mother's easy smile and his grandfather's stubborn chin. He carried the boxes inside with the effortless strength of youth, filling the little cabin with the clatter of new things and the smell of town. "So this is where you've been hiding," Daniel said, looking around with open curiosity. His gaze paused on the jar with the candle stub inside. "Is that the famous piece of equipment?" He grinned. tapping the glass lightly with a knuckle. Harold chuckled. "That's the one," he said. Not much to look at, but it made quite an impression on one youngster this winter. He told the story slowly, letting the details settle between them, the nightly sounds, the first glimpse of frightened eyes, the steady presence of the mother on the edge of the light. Daniel listened with the kind of attention that made Harold feel his words were worth something. After lunch, they stepped outside together. The snow had retreated from the porch, leaving damp, dark boards. In the slush beyond the steps, a fresh set of tracks curved gracefully, their round shapes clear in the soft surface. Daniel crouched to study them, eyebrows rising. They really come this close? He asked softly. Closer. Sometimes, Harold replied. He shifted his weight onto his cane, the wooden handle warm under his palm. Stay still a minute. He lifted his face toward the ridge, listening. On the wind, faint but unmistakable, came a low, throaty call, answered moments later by a smaller, higher note. Daniel straightened slowly, eyes scanning the slope. It took him a few seconds, but then he saw the mother first, standing on a sun-warmed outcrop with her tail draped over the edge, and the now nearly grown cub beside her, coat thick and shining. They watched the cabin calmly, two pale sentinels against the dark rock. Wow, Daniel breathed. They're beautiful. For a long moment, the 3 generations old man, young man, and wild family regarded one another across the thinning snow. The cub's gaze shifted from Harold to the window where the jar's distorted outline showed on the table. Its ears flicked forward, and, as if remembering, it gave a short, huffing sound that carried faintly on the air. Harold felt his chest swell, not with the tightness of fear, but with a deep, quiet satisfaction. They're the reason I'm not done with these hills yet, he said. Well, them and you lot down below. He nudged Daniel gently with his elbow. I figure as long as I can get up here for part of the year, he'll keep an eye on things, and they'll keep an eye on me. That evening, as the sun slid behind the peaks and painted the sky in layers of rose and gold, Harold lit the candle in the jar once more. The flame wavered, then steadied, casting gentle rings of light through the imperfect glass. Daniel sat on the porch, stepped beside him, shoulders touching, while the air cooled and the first stars pricked through the fading colour. Out in the half-dark, a familiar shape appeared near the tree line. The cub, larger now, but still carrying a hint of youthful clumsiness, moved with deliberate steps toward the porch, stopping at the edge of the lamplight. It sat, tail curling around its paws, and stared at the glowing jar, as if checking that the small star was still in its proper place. Behind it, the mother lingered in deeper shadow, her gaze sweeping over the cabin, the grandson, the old man with the cane. Harold met her eyes across the distance, feeling the old, steady rumble of gratitude and understanding somewhere beneath his ribs. She had brought her child to him once in panic and trust, a wild act of desperation that had cracked open a winter in his heart. In the seasons since, she had taught him, without words, how to walk again between memory and the present, between grief and the ongoing work of living. He raised his mug in a small, informal salute. "We're still here," he said quietly. "All of us." The mother's tail flicked once in acknowledgement. After a moment, she turned, and the almost grown cub rose to follow, glancing back only once at the candle in the glass. Then they slipped into the trees, swallowed by the gentle noise of the evening. The night settled slowly around the cabin. Inside, the radio sat ready on its shelf, new batteries humming softly. On the table, the jar burned with a calm, steady light, its sides remembering breath and frost, and one frightened youngster seeing the world through curved glass. Harold listened to the soft creak of the boards, the distant rush of the river, and the quiet breathing of his sleeping grandson in the next room. He knew there would be other storms, other winters, perhaps years when his legs would no longer carry him up to this perch. But the mountains now held more than loss for him. They held a living bond, tracks in the snow, eyes in the dusk, a shared history etched in glass and fur and human hands that had chosen to help. As the candle's flame drew a thin, golden line across the inside of the jar, he settled deeper into his chair and smiled, content in the simple, enduring truth. He and the wild had found each other in time, and neither would leave quite the same. If this story touched your heart, drop a simple 1 in the comments to let us know you were here. Your support keeps these gentle stories alive. Don't forget to subscribe and stay with us, because the next story might just be the one that finds you when you least expect it.